Well, good morning, and can I wish you a Merry Christmas? Those of you who are purists will know that we're hardly even halfway through Christmas. Christmas started on the 25th of December, so this is only the 5th day of Christmas, so still plenty of time. Some of you, on the other hand, have probably already begun to get your Christmas decorations down. But either way, I hope you've had a good Christmas season. We're actually going to fast forward to Easter this morning, as in terms of this message, which is a message that I hope is an encouragement as we come to the end of this year and as we anticipate moving into 2025. Chris has read to us a number of sections from 1 Corinthians chapter 15. And the focus is going to be on the last verse of the chapter. And I'll just read that again, where Paul writes, "Therefore, my dear brothers and sisters, stand firm, let nothing move you. Always give yourselves fully to the work of the Lord, because you know that your labor in the Lord is not in vain." Now, some of you who are football fans will remember Arsene Wenger, who was the manager of Arsenal for quite a number of years. And in December 2002, he was talking about the state of the Premier League and who was likely to win it. And he said this, he said, "Christmas is important, but not decisive." He then went on to say that Easter, on the other hand, was more likely to tell a tale. Now, he was talking about football. He was talking about whether Christmas was too soon to be making any big predictions about how the season would end for certain teams. He was actually talking about Liverpool, and maybe there's a cautionary tale for those of you who follow the masses and support Liverpool even today. But he could almost have been talking about the story of the gospel, couldn't he? Christmas is important, but it's not decisive. Easter is decisive. And so on this last Sunday of the year, I want us to press the fast forward button, and I want us to jump all the way from Christmas through to Easter, and we want to think a little bit about this verse at the end of 1 Corinthians chapter 15. "Therefore, my dear brothers and sisters, stand firm. Let nothing move you. Always give yourselves fully to the work of the Lord, because you know that your labor in the Lord is not in vain." Let me read it from the ESV. Some of you probably are using the ESV, and you'll have noticed it's slightly different here and there. It says, "Therefore, my beloved brothers, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that in the Lord your labor is not in vain." Now, the verse, as many of you know, the verse comes at the end of a chapter in which Paul has been talking about the significance, the importance of this doctrine of the resurrection. Clearly, one of the problems that was affecting the Corinthian church, and there were many, was the fact that there were people there who didn't believe in this concept of the resurrection. They probably lined up behind the view that many people would have had in their culture, that death was permanent. That was it. Tom Wright quotes from an ancient Greek play where Apollo proclaims that once a man has died and the dust has soaked up his blood, there is no resurrection. Now, you don't need to look too far to find modern-day equivalents. In 2001, on Good Friday 2001, there was an Easter-related tweet appeared that stirred up quite a response. The author was a lady called Professor Alice Roberts. She's a professor in the University of Birmingham. And here's what she tweeted. She said, "Just a little reminder today, dead people don't come back to life." That's what some of the Corinthians thought. That's even what some of the Corinthians within the church had begun to think. And so Paul has to address it, because he says, if there's no such thing as people being raised from the dead, well, not even Christ himself has been raised. Now, some of you will remember Jenga or be familiar with Jenga. Did anybody play Jenga over the Christmas holidays? Just as a matter of interest, you're allowed to put your hand up. Nobody will think that it reflects your theology or anything like that. There's one person played Jenga. So you know the idea of Jenga, the tower of wooden blocks, And the idea is that you pull wooden blocks out of the tower and build it back on the top until eventually there's one of the wooden blocks, and when you pull it out, the whole thing collapses. And the point is to try to make sure that you remove the blocks without collapsing the tower. Well, I think it's actually quite a good illustration of what Paul's talking about in 1 Corinthians 15, even though we'd never heard of Jenga. Because Paul's point is that if Christ has not been raised, then everything collapses. That is the block that if you pull it out, the whole house comes tumbling down. There's no gospel. There's no point in believing. There is actually no hope. The followers of Jesus are misguided, more misguided than anybody, more miserable than anybody, and actually would be far better off just embracing the hedonism of the surrounding culture. But if Christ has been raised, then everything changes. I have a friend in England whose name is Steve. He's a retired church leader. And he told me about a story about his father. His father had been a pilot in World War II. He died, I think, just earlier this year. He died at age 100. His father's name was Jimmy James. Not sure why you would call your child Jimmy if your surname was James, but that's what happened to him. And he was actually part of an Australian squadron of pilots that flew out of Italy. And in September 1944, he was on a mission, and his plane was hit by enemy fire. Now, he tried to take action and get himself out of the plane, but very quickly his plane caught fire, and he was trapped in the cockpit. Now, he wasn't a believer at the time. Eventually, he became a believer, not surprisingly. But he wasn't a believer at the time, but he prayed. Somehow he knew to do that. And a remarkable thing happened. It was as though a force lifted him out of the cockpit, bounced him onto the wing. He managed to open his parachute, and he made it to the ground where he was captured by the Germans. Now, his colleagues who were flying with him had not seen the parachute open. So Jimmy James was reported missing, believed killed. That's the message that was sent to his parents. They lived in a little Welsh village, and that's the message that came to them. Jimmy James, missing, believed killed. But of course, he wasn't dead. And several months later, the news came through that in actual fact, he had not been killed. And the postmistress, her name was Verena, little detail, the postmistress got the telegram, and she was so excited that she ran down the street in this little Welsh village just shouting, "He's alive! He's alive!" You can imagine the excitement that there must have been in the village. And what a transformation. Jimmy James was alive, and that made all the difference. And how much more should the news that Jesus is alive make a difference to us? Interestingly, a recent Baptist theologian called Paul Beasley Murray said that if the church had contemplated the empty tomb as much as the cross of its Lord, its life would have been more exhilarating and its contribution to the world more positive than has been the case. That's quite a thought, isn't it? Now, I'm glad we don't have to choose, really, between the empty tomb and the cross, because you can't actually have one without the other. And if you try to have one without the other, what you'll end up with is less than Christianity. But it's worth listening to that statement again, isn't it? It's challenging. If the church had contemplated the empty tomb as much as the cross of its Lord, its life would have been more exhilarating and its contribution to the world more positive than has been the case. So with all that in mind, what do we need to take from 1 Corinthians 15, verse 58? Well, I want to suggest to you that this verse is in it. It tells us that there is something to be, and that is to be steadfast and immovable. There is something to do, and that is to give ourselves fully to the work of the Lord. And there is something to know, and that is that our work is not in vain. So that's fairly simple, hopefully something that we can take away with us. And I want to obviously say a little bit more than just that. but hang a few ideas around these points. So there's something to be, there's something to do, and there's something to know. So something to be. We are to be steadfast and immovable, or stand firm and let nothing move you. Now, you probably realize that the line between being steadfast and being stubborn is a very fine line. And if you've got into an argument or a difference of opinion with your spouse, you have probably realized that. Steadfastness and stubborn are very close relatives. And of course, stubbornness is not such an endearing quality, but there absolutely are times when we need to stand firm, to be steadfast. Now, interestingly, if you go all the way back up to the start of the chapter, you'll see that Paul's already talked about taking a stand. Here's what he says at the beginning. I want to remind you of the gospel I preached to you, which you received and on which you have taken your stand. By this gospel you are saved if you hold firmly to the word I preached to you. And he goes on then to remind them that Christ died, Christ was buried, and Christ was raised again. And his point is that if you have believed that, then you need to stand firm in it and on it, including on the bit that some of the sophisticated and influential people around you might tell you is nonsense. Don't drift from it, and do not allow yourself to get blown off course about it. Because if Christ is not raised, then the message of the gospel is meaningless, and our faith in that message is futile. I once read about a farmer. He lived in Chelmsford. This happened just a few years ago. He lived in Chelmsford, and he was looking for a replacement second-hand tractor. I think he had an older tractor, and it was past its best. And he began looking for this new tractor and discovered that they're really quite expensive. Don't know if you knew that, but apparently so. So he went to eBay. And on eBay, he found that there was somebody in Hampshire who was selling a tractor for just under £8,500. So he tried to do the due diligence as best he could, was in touch with this person, handed over the money, but there was no tractor. It was a scam. Now think about it. The farmer had believed what he'd read on the website of eBay. He had complete confidence in the person at the other end of the deal, but his faith was futile. And if Jesus has not been raised, it doesn't matter what we believed or who we've put confidence in, but if Jesus has not been raised, then our faith is futile. And according to what Paul says, if Jesus hasn't been raised, there is no forgiveness. Verse 17 says we're still in our sins. And there is no hope. He says in verse 19, we are of all people to be pitied. But his point is that if Jesus has been raised, then this message is not meaningless and our faith is not futile. And that, in fact, is where we need to take our stand. And we can actually say, in the words of a recent song, we can say, no fate I dread. I know I am forgiven. The future sure. The price it has been paid. For Jesus bled and suffered for my pardon. And he was raised to overthrow the grave. There's something to be. It is to be steadfast and immovable. Second thing is that there's something to do. The verse goes on to say that we should always give ourselves to the work of the Lord, or we should be always abounding in the work of the Lord. Now, some of you are old enough to remember, or may actually still have, an amplified translation of the Bible. So we had one person who had played Jenga over Christmas. Has anybody got an amplified version of the Bible, the amplified translation? Oh, look at that. And probably, I have one that my wife bought me on our 3rd wedding anniversary. Don't know if she remembers that, but I have one. But I don't tend to use it. It's interesting that the people who put their hands up for that tend to be, we tend to be of an age. It's probably not as popular as it used to be. It's a bit of a clumsy translation in a way because it likes to give more than one word or more than one option for every bit of the translation. So there's brackets and square brackets and all those kind of things. But it's interesting to see what it says here in this verse. It says this: "Therefore, my beloved brothers and sisters, be steadfast and immovable, always excelling in the word of the Lord." And then there's one of the famous square brackets: "Always doing your best and doing more than is needed." Trying to get all of the ideas from one Greek word, one Greek expression into English. Always excelling, always doing your best, always doing more than what is needed. That's quite an attitude to have, isn't it? Towards anything that we would do. Always excelling, always doing your best, always doing more than what is needed. And that's the attitude that we're to have towards the work of God. But what is this work of God, or this work of the Lord? The exact expression doesn't occur that much in the Bible. But I think because of the context of one or two other references in 1 Corinthians, I think Paul's particularly thinking about gospel work where the people of God are being built up. He actually talks in chapter 14 about excelling, it's the same word, in gifts of the Spirit that build up the church. In other words, if God has given you something to do that contributes to that, then give yourself to it wholeheartedly, always excelling, always doing your best, always doing more than is needed. Now, not everybody's going to have the same thing to do. And probably, as you're well aware, the New Testament gives us an amazing picture of the church as an example of unity in diversity. Paul says we have different gifts according to the grace that has been given to us. And once you know how God has equipped you through the Spirit, then you get to work. For some, that will involve speaking. For others, it will involve things that are much more practical. For some, it will be up front. For others, it will be much more in a place of obscurity. And that may even change during your lifetime. Always excelling, always doing your best, always doing more than what is needed. But I need to say a little more about this, because some of you may be thinking that the work you contribute here in the church is a relatively small part of your life. And you may think, well, it's all very well for people who work for churches or Christian charities or other Christian organizations and such like. But what about the rest of us who do a bit here, but what about the other 40 or 50 hours? Does God have anything to say about that kind of work? Well, I think he does. Isn't it interesting that some of the most significant characters in the Old Testament were neither priests nor prophets? Some of them were senior government officials. Some of them were civil servants. That is where they spent a great deal of their time and a great deal of their energy. And the New Testament tells us in a couple of places that whatever we do, we are to do it with all our heart as though working for the Lord. That opens things up quite a bit, doesn't it? Think about the potential in your workplace. Think about what it would mean to go about your work, those 40 or 50 hours that you don't spend in here. Think about what it would mean to do that with a deliberate consciousness that you are a citizen of the kingdom of God. And a consciousness that what you do has the potential to reflect the goodness and the grace of that kingdom wherever you go. A nurse exuding kindness in a hospital ward. A teacher who demonstrates patience in a classroom. A company owner, a business owner, whose people know that they are valued just as much as the balance sheet. A student who has learned to write essays to the glory of God. That's worth thinking about, isn't it? Always give yourselves fully to the work of the Lord. So there's something to be, there's something to do, and finally there is something to know. One of the things that makes the end of our lives such a difficult prospect for many people is the prospect of being forgotten, or the prospect of realizing that once you've gone, the work that you did, it will largely be forgotten as well. Here's a little thought experiment. Think for a moment about your great-grandfather. Your great-grandfather. How much do you know about your great-grandfather? You don't need to shout this out or anything like that, but how much do you know about your great-grandfather? Do you know what his first name was? Some of you do, some of you probably don't. Do you know whether he enjoyed listening to the radio? If he did, what did he like listening to? Do you know what kind of a car he drove? Did you know even if he drove a car? Do you know much about him at all? Do you know what his job was? It's only a couple of generations ago, and yet very quickly forgotten. And of course, there are people who leave a legacy in one way or another. Maybe they've got a charity named after them or a building named after them. Maybe they have a fund that they've been wealthy enough to leave a fund behind that allows important work to be done for decades that after they've gone. Maybe it's someone who's written books, and those books are still being read years after they've been written. But what about the work we do for God? What about someone who gives themselves to the work of the gospel? What about someone who turns down a career opportunity because they know that that particular opportunity would limit their ability to have an influence for Jesus? What about that? Does that last? Well, here's what you need to know. You know that your labor in the Lord is not in vain. Your labor in the Lord is not in vain. You know, one of my favorite stories in the Old Testament is the story of Nehemiah. And again, some of you are familiar with it. Nehemiah travels to Jerusalem to lead the work of rebuilding this ruined city. And early on, as the building work has begun, there's one of the local chieftains. His name is Tobiah. And he comes along with some of his friends. And they're trying to discourage the builders. And Tobiah looks at the wall and he says, yes, you know, look, you guys, what you're doing there, it's really just quite pathetic. Even if a fox stood on that wall, the wall would collapse. And maybe sometimes you and I think that what we're doing doesn't really make much of a difference. It seems, and it certainly seems perhaps in the eyes of many people among our friends or many people in the culture, it seems that that's just pathetic. You're wasting your time. And Paul says here, no, you're not wasting your time. And you notice that he talks about labor. He says your labor in the Lord is not in vain. Labor is a word that means that the work we do is not meant to be easy. And for Paul, it certainly wasn't easy. It was life-threatening. Sometimes it involved fierce conflict. Why would you do that? Why would you risk your life, or why would you get into tough situations? Why would you put your back into something if there's nothing beyond? Why would you do all that if the bones of Jesus have simply decayed in a grave somewhere, and that's what waits for you as well? And you look back at what Paul says in verse 31 and 32. He says, I face death every day. Yes, just as surely as I boast about you and Jesus our Lord. If I fought wild beasts in Ephesus with no more than human hopes, what have I gained? If the dead are not raised, let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. But if Christ has been raised, and if in him we have the promise that we too will be raised, then we know, says Paul, that our work in the Lord is not in vain. Gospel message is not meaningless. Our faith in that message is not futile. And our work is not worthless. We can give ourselves to it. We can work hard at it, knowing that it is not in vain. C.T. Studd was a British missionary. When he was a young man, he'd been a very gifted cricketer. He chose to spend his life working as a missionary. God called him. He worked in several overseas countries, and he founded WEC, the mission, which obviously has outlived him. And he once wrote very famously these words. He said, "Only one life, 'twill soon be past. Only what's done for Christ will last." It's challenging. And it's a good challenge for 2025. But the flip side is also true, isn't it? Not only what's done for Christ will last, but what is done for Christ will last. Your labor in God is not in vain. And so we can give ourselves to the work of the Lord because we know that it is not in vain. And it is not in vain because Jesus is alive. So there's something to be. Be steadfast. Don't be blown off course. There's something to do. Give yourself to the work of the Lord. And there's something to know. What you do for Him will not be in vain. Here's the verse one more time, this time in the Amplified Version. Therefore, my beloved brothers and sisters, be steadfast, immovable, always excelling in the work of the Lord, always doing your best and more than is needed, being continually aware that your labor, even to the point of exhaustion, in the Lord is not futile nor wasted. It is never without purpose. Let's just bow for a moment before Jonathan and the band come to lead us. Let's just bow for a moment and be quiet. And I want to invite you to look back and review 2024. I want you to take a moment to do that. And to take a moment as you do that, committing the work of the year to the Lord. It has not been in vain. Some of you have probably worked hard. You've given yourselves to the work of the Lord. As you commit 2024 to the Lord as we prepare to leave it behind us, you can commit that work to Him knowing it's not in vain. And look ahead to 2025. And as you do that, would you dedicate yourself or rededicate yourself to the work of the Lord? Would you say, Lord, show me what I can do. Show me how I can make the most of those opportunities that you give me. How can I give myself fully, knowing that you give me the opportunity to do something that will last? Look back, look forward, knowing that in the Lord your labor is not